The pitch and the pledge was to keep this focused on tech. So I would like to ask you, why is Kamala Harris the best candidate for the technology industry and venture capitalists around the US?
Well, so what the tech industry needs is kind of a stable environment in order to, kind of follow the rules and prosper in. An ability, because by the way, one of the things that the tech industry brings to the U.S. is it's one of our most successful global industries, where most of, for example, the large tech companies get the vast majority of their revenues overseas, like the majority, and depends on the business, and so good global relations, in addition to stability, and an ability to kind of know that you're following a rule of law versus what I think of as grifter capitalism. All of that leads to, the reason why I and others like me support Vice President Harris for president, because I think those are the more fundamental things than, whether or not a corporate tax rate goes up or down a little. Obviously, those can be important in other times for business. But that's the reason why I think within the technology industry, I think it's a fairly clear choice.
Reid, we recently had SEC Chair Gary Gensler on the program. And a part of the conversation for both candidates is continuity at the FTC and the SEC. You've actually spoken publicly, I think, about both already. But what is your latest position on those two roles, Lina Khan and Gary Gensler, if Kamala Harris were to continue in the White House due to their impact on the technology industry?
Well, let's see. So first, since I've spoken, because I get asked a lot about Lina Khan, I've spoken more about Lina Khan. One misconception to clear up is I've never, ever talked to Kamala Harris or anyone in the White House about Lina Khan for this. So this is entirely a press set of stories where I'm asked about my point of view. And I think she's done a very good job on a number of things, the anti-compete stuff, the click to cancel and subscriptions, a number of things. On M&A, speaking as a partner at Greylock and as a Silicon Valley person who invests in companies trying to create the next generation of large tech companies, her, kind of like waging war on M&A is actually, in fact, as unhelpful to the tech industry. It actually accomplishes something different than what she thinks she's accomplishing. She thinks she's trying to accomplish the kind of the limitation of the growth of the large tech companies, and actually, in fact, she's causing a lack of funding for any of the companies that might potentially compete with them. And so that's a different thing. And that's the Lina Khan, which I still have the same point of view, and I've asked about it from anyone from an expertise point of view. I will continue to say that. Gary Gensler, I think the question, and I know Gary, I've talked to him from the MIT days, is how do you kind of shift kind of a kind of approach to crypto that's less kind of hit with stick and more of a, here's the set of rules that we could set out that would create a beneficial technological investment that helps U.S. position globally. And I think it's been uneven. And so I would hope that, Vice President Harris, who grew up within the California tech community, understands the importance of this kind of rule of law, kind of equal basis, innovation economy. She talked about, kind of innovation opportunities. She's the only presidential candidate in U.S. history who's spoken about the importance of founders. And so I hope that she would bring a kind of a more innovation forward point of view here and, would anticipate that.
An innovation forward perspective, is that the key difference that you anticipate if hypothetically we had a Harris administration, a difference from the current Biden administration, or where else might she differ?
Well, I think so. So she has always brought a certain, because talked to her over the years in this, intellectual curiosity to what's going on in the tech industry, how that can help everyday Americans, how that can help the rest of American industry. And so it's kind of like, look, I realize that the tech industry is about innovation and building new things, and those building of new things are new products and services, but there are also ways that can help all of America. And those are the questions that she's asked. Now, Biden, who has done a number of great things in his presidency, he's controlled inflation better than, post-COVID than any other, kind of first world country in doing that, and I think has done a number of very good things. But he has not been as engaged with the tech industry, whereas I think Vice President Harris, including, kind of in her very acceptance speech, has been. And so I think that kind of how do we engage in the conversation? I mean, look, for example, what she did in the artificial intelligence, regulation and executive order process. She ran that. First thing she did is she brought all the companies into the White House to say, hey, we really need you guys to be going foot forward on safety and regulation. What kinds of things can you voluntarily commit to? I talked to the folks who were there. She pushed them very hard on that. Then she looked at, okay, so this is what they can commit to. Here's what we can put into an executive order law. Here's what we can do to ongoing monitor what happened and leave room for innovation. That's what I expect across her approach in the entire technology industry, with AI as the instance of it.
Let's go to the other hypothetical, because she's engaging at the moment with the tech community. But many would say that Trump is very much engaging with the technology community with the amount that he's having Elon Musk on stage. If we see Musk taking a bigger role within a future administration, what does that mean for you and ultimately for the relationship that Silicon Valley has with Elon Musk?
Well, I think it depends on what the Trump administration, what Elon does. I think, the Trump, Trump in Trump presidency one, his early presidency has shown a certain amount of grifter capitalism. It's like trying to penalize his opponents using the instruments of state. Obviously, we saw that happen with Amazon, which probably is, no inside knowledge, but probably correlated with Bezos's, forbidding the Washington Post from issuing a support statement. And so it's kind of like if you're going to be individual company retaliatory, it's part of what might underlie a tariffs regime, is I can choose like who I'm doling out favors to. That does not create a good, stable environment for investing in, how do you invest in an overall industry and ecosystem? And so then the question, would come down with Elon. Obviously, Elon's businesses have great ties to government. I mean, the whole space business is deeply tied to regulation and kind of government contracts. Automobiles is also tied to a bunch of regulatory frameworks. Obviously, what's going on with, media and information has ties there too. And I think, unfortunately, X.com is the primary supporter of conspiracy theories and, other kinds of things, which is a serious problem. All of that, the question is, all right, well, does it continue to be grifter capitalism, which is calling out to specific companies, or is it rule of law?
Reid, on the X and conspiracy theories, Bloomberg did a deep report, a data-based piece of investigative journalism on that recently. And in that segment on the show, which you can find on YouTube, we gave X's point of view, which is that they disagree with that. And if you allow me to, I've invited Elon Musk onto this program many times, and you are here and he's not. Something's different in this election. You're a well-known person in the world of technology, but there are others on both sides who are speaking out, in my experience, more prominently than previously. Have there been any negative consequences of that? For example, if you are a venture capitalist or a CEO, that publicly speaking about your political orientation and your support of a candidate has resulted in a loss of opportunity in deals or whatever it may be?
Well, I've seen, and, I think, this in something that's this fraught, I don't think it's just, retaliation in business circumstances from folks who are supporting Trump. Like I saw, when VCs were speaking out, some LPs were very supportive of Trump, not at Greylock in this, but in other firms, withdrew their support from the venture firms. I've seen other kinds of things where, people, business relationships have soured because of it, which I think is very unfortunate. I mean, I actually think that part of what we should aspire to as Americans and as business people is to kind of say, hey, look, what we should do is say, what's the thing that we do to make American business and American industry better? And like I've heard of Republican senators trash talking me internationally, where you think they'd be supportive of American business people. So I think that I think there are consequences of it, which I think is unfortunate. But I think it's more important to be kind of patriotic about what is good for America, American industry, and American society, even when you have this fear.
Let's talking about the souring of certain relationships. The first one that comes to my mind is the souring of the relationship of who was a co-founder of OpenAI, Elon Musk, and now OpenAI more explicitly in its new form. Have you spoken to Sam Altman about, and indeed OpenAI, about the worries of Elon Musk, who seems to have a dislike for the business? If he took a more prominent role within the administration, what would it look like for AI more broadly to have Elon Musk in a position of power?
Well, one of the things that I would worry about if Elon took a more prominent role is that he would view that the only real success for kind of the AI industry is if he is doing it. I mean, this is part of the question around the fact that he's kind of doing these baseless lawsuits against OpenAI. That are, kind of like, well, I gave money philanthropically and I should get a cut of what then turns into commercial, which is, by the way, illegal, right? And so, so that kind of issue might then rear its head in this kind of tradition of, kind of Trump's grifter capitalism. I would hope that actually, in fact, if Elon were to accept a role, that he would go, look, what I care about is all of the tech sector, American industry, not just my own efforts. And I think we'd have to see what would play out then.
The latest on the litigation between the two, I believe, was October 8th, when OpenAI accused Elon Musk of harassment in that legal fight. And again, we've covered it on this program, Reed, and we'll go back to it. Is AI and regulation of AI being discussed enough in this election by either candidate?
Well, I'm not sure that it's the most central thing for kind of the general American society at the moment. Look, I think how we get the benefits of AI for American industry, American society, American consumers, I think is really important. And one of the things about regulation is it tends to slow down innovation. It tends to delay. And I think our tools for getting a medical assistant on every smartphone, a tutor on every smartphone for every American, and maybe even more globally, I think those are the important things to be trying to get to. And that's less of a discussion about, AI in the election, but more kind of we should be building towards the future.
Reed, if former President Trump were to get a second term in office, how are you preparing for that, and how do you approach it were that to be the case?
Well, if that's the case, then I would hope for the folks who have argued to me that you shouldn't actually, in fact, take President Trump's words seriously. That the fact that he is declaring like a tariff war where he can do individual kind of grifter capitalism, that's actually not what he's going to do. That he's going to try to be more business forward, more technology forward, and you should not be paying attention to what his words are. I would hope that they would be correct. If it ends up being what I fear, which is actually in fact a kind of an individual kind of like sweating various businesses for his own kind of political favor, I think that will affect American industry in a way that will affect American prosperity. And so I think you build in more resilience to chaos and uncertainty, and that's what you would do. I'm obviously very hopeful that Vice President Harris will win the election, and so therefore haven't done enormous contingency planning yet.